History is not written in silence. It is carved into landscapes, whispered through traditions, and carried forward by generations. Canada, the world's second largest country, was not simply born. It was forged through ice, rivers, and survival. Beneath the snow-covered wilderness lies a tale of resilience, of indigenous nations who shaped this land for millennia, of explorers who dared cross an ocean, and of settlers who struggled to endure its winters. This is not just the history of a nation. It is the epic story of how a wilderness became Canada. Welcome to the beginning of that journey. Canada's history begins long before the name Canada was ever spoken. Thousands of years ago, as the last ice age retreated, vast glaciers carved valleys, filled lakes, and shaped the landscape we see today. Into this land came the first peoples, ancestors of today's indigenous nations. Archaeologists believe they crossed a land bridge, known as Beringia, from Siberia into Alaska, then gradually spread across the continent. For more than 12,000 years they thrived here, adapting to forests, plains, mountains, and the frozen Arctic. In the Pacific Northwest, peoples like the Haida and Tlingit built great cedar houses, carved towering totem poles, and mastered ocean navigation. On the vast prairies, Blackfoot and Cree communities followed immense herds of bison, developing hunting traditions that sustained them for centuries. In the east, the Iroquois Confederacy built powerful alliances and established villages of longhouses, practicing agriculture and diplomacy. And in the Arctic, the Inuit developed ingenious tools like the kayak and igloo, surviving some of the harshest climates on Earth. Each community carried unique languages, beliefs, and governance systems. Contrary to colonial myths, they were not wandering tribes, but complex nations with laws, traditions, and trade networks. Birch bark canoes traveled rivers linking communities thousands of miles apart. Seashells from the Atlantic coast have been found in the prairies, showing the vast extent of indigenous trade long before Europeans arrived. But across the ocean, winds of change were blowing. Around the year 1000, Norse explorers from Greenland, led by Leif Erikson, reached what is today Newfoundland. At L'Anse aux Meadows, they built a small settlement. It lasted only a few years, but it marks one of the first known European presences in the Americas. Then, for centuries, Canada remained untouched by outside powers. That changed in the late 15th century. In 1497, John Cabot, sailing for England, reached the coasts of Newfoundland. His voyage reported seas teeming with fish, so abundant that crews claimed they could simply scoop them from the water. Soon, fleets of European fishermen came seasonally, drying cod on the rocky shores before sailing home. Yet, they did not settle permanently. The first serious claim came from France. In 1534, Jacques Cartier sailed into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Encountering the Iroquoian people, he heard the word Kanata, meaning village or settlement. Misunderstanding it, Cartier began using Canada to describe the entire region. Although France attempted colonies, they failed until 1608, when Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec City. From there, New France began to take root. Unlike Spain's conquests further south, France did not find gold or silver. Instead, their wealth came from the fur trade, especially beaver pelts, prized in Europe for hat making. The French quickly built alliances with indigenous nations, exchanging metal tools, cloth, and firearms for furs. Champlain himself fought alongside the Huron against the Iroquois, forging bonds but also sparking long conflicts. Yet with trade came devastating consequences. Diseases carried by Europeans, smallpox, influenza, measles, swept through indigenous communities. Populations that had flourished for millennia were suddenly decimated, in some cases losing more than half their people within a generation. Entire villages disappeared. By the 1600s and 1700s, New France stretched deep into the continent. French explorers like La Salle journeyed down the Mississippi River to Louisiana, while traders ventured west by canoe. The Hudson's Bay Company, chartered by the English in 1670, established trading posts along Hudson Bay, sparking fierce economic rivalry with French traders. conflict between France and Britain was inevitable. Through the 18th century, North America became a battleground. The decisive moment came during the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, known in North America as the French and Indian War. In 1759, British troops defeated the French at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, just outside Quebec City. 1 year later, Montreal fell. The Treaty of Paris, 1763, handed Canada to Britain. But France did not vanish. French Canadians, farmers along the St. Lawrence, Catholic priests, merchants remained, preserving their language and identity under British rule. This cultural divide would shape Canada forever. The late 18th century brought new waves of people. After the American Revolution, more than 40,000 loyalists, colonists loyal to Britain, fled north to Canada, reshaping its demographics. Some settled in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, others in what became Ontario. Among them were free black loyalists and enslaved Africans, whose stories form a lesser-known but vital part of Canadian history. The early 19th century saw Canada tested again. The War of 1812 pitted Britain and its Canadian colonies against the United States. Though neither side won decisively, Canadians celebrated the defense of their land. Figures like Laura Secord, who warned British troops of an American attack, became national legends. As the century progressed, pressure grew for unity. Canada remained divided into colonies: Upper Canada, Ontario; Lower Canada, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. Political conflict, economic struggles, and fear of American expansion pushed leaders toward federation. In 1867, the British North America Act created the Dominion of Canada, uniting Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. This was the birth of Canada, not fully independent but with self-governing powers. Over time, more provinces joined: Manitoba and the Northwest Territories in 1870, British Columbia in 1871, Prince Edward Island in 1873, and others in the years that followed. The completion of the Canadian Pacific Railway in 1885 symbolized this new nation. Steel tracks stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific, binding the country together. But behind the triumphs lay deep wounds. Indigenous peoples were pushed onto reserves, their lands taken for settlement and resource extraction. The Indian Act of 1876 gave the Canadian government sweeping control over their lives. Most devastating of all was the residential school system. Run by churches and funded by the government, these schools aimed to erase Indigenous languages and cultures. Children were taken from their families, forbidden to speak their languages, and often subjected to abuse. The scars of this system remain today, a dark chapter Canada continues to confront. Still, Canada evolved. By the early 20th century, it was a growing, diverse country. Its soldiers fought in World War I and II, earning international respect. Step by step, Canada gained independence, from the Statute of Westminster in 1931 to full constitutional control in 1982. Thus, the story of Canada is not one of simple conquest or progress. It is a story of resilience, of Indigenous nations who endured against oppression, of settlers who carved lives from wilderness, and of immigrants who brought new dreams to its shores. Canada's history is both inspiring and tragic, a tapestry woven from countless struggles and hopes. As we stand at the beginning of Canada's story, one thing becomes clear: this nation was not created overnight. It was shaped by centuries of survival, conflict, cooperation, and compromise. Chapter 1 has taken us from the footsteps of the first peoples across icy plains to the first French settlers at Quebec, from the clash of empires to the creation of a new dominion. But this is only the beginning of the journey. Canada today is often described as peaceful, diverse, and polite. Yet behind that image lies a history of deep struggles, some remembered, some hidden. To understand modern Canada, we must carry both sides of its past, the triumphs and the tragedies. On one side, there is the resilience of Indigenous peoples, the endurance of French Canadians, and the ambition of British settlers. On the other side, there are wounds, the loss of Indigenous lands, the pain of cultural erasure, and the divisions between communities. Canada's strength lies in its ability to hold these contradictions together, to build a country not by erasing differences, but by learning to live with them. When Confederation began in 1867, few could imagine the Canada of today. The Dominion started with just 4 provinces, a fragile experiment in unity. Yet within decades it grew to stretch across the continent. The Canadian Pacific Railway was not just an engineering marvel. It was a statement of ambition, a promise that Canada would endure from coast to coast. But the cost of this expansion was heavy. The westward push meant the displacement of Indigenous peoples, the near extinction of the bison, and violent conflicts like the Northwest Rebellion of 1885. These stories remind us that Canada's growth was not peaceful for everyone. It often came at the expense of others. And yet, Canada was also a land of opportunity. Waves of immigrants arrived from Europe, Asia, and beyond. Ukrainians tilled the prairie soil. Chinese workers built railways under brutal conditions. Italians, Irish, Jews, and later South Asians and Middle Easterners brought cultures that enriched the mosaic of Canada. By the 20th century, Canada was no longer just French and English. It was becoming a home for the world. In global conflicts, Canada proved itself. In World War I, Canadian soldiers at Vimy Ridge showed courage that earned international respect. In World War II, they played key roles in Europe and the Pacific. These sacrifices gave Canada a stronger voice on the world stage, moving it further from Britain's shadow. The 20th century also saw Canada define its values. Universal health care, peacekeeping missions, bilingualism, multiculturalism, all became symbols of the modern nation. In 1982, the Constitution was repatriated, and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms was born. For the first time, Canada fully controlled its own destiny, and yet, the story remains incomplete. Today, Canada continues to reckon with its past, especially the injustices faced by Indigenous peoples. Reconciliation is not a word but a challenge, to acknowledge the pain, to honor the survivors, and to build a future rooted in respect. As we move deeper into Canada's history in the coming chapters, we will see stories of war and peace, of politics and people, of ordinary lives that shaped extraordinary events. From the fur trade to Confederation, from rebellion to reconciliation, each chapter adds another piece to the puzzle of what Canada truly is. Canada's history is not only about dates and treaties, it is about people, families who braved winters, communities that built cities, voices that demanded justice. To understand Canada is to listen to those voices, to walk through the snow and forests where they once walked, and to see the country not as a finished nation, but as a story still unfolding. This is chapter 1 of that story. The land, the peoples, the first encounters, the battles, and the birth of a nation. But there is much more to come. Stay with us as we journey deeper into the struggles and triumphs that made Canada what it is today. Every nation is born from stories, but Canada's story begins with mysteries that continue to echo across time. Stretching across nearly 10 million square kilometers, Canada is a land of staggering beauty and harsh extremes, a place where ice, forest, and ocean collide. Yet beyond its landscape, Canada carries secrets buried in its soil, carved into its stones, and whispered through its legends. To understand its history, one must first confront the unanswered questions that have puzzled explorers, historians, and Indigenous elders for centuries. Long before Europeans sailed across the Atlantic, this vast land was already alive with human presence. Archaeologists believe that the first people set foot here at least 12 to 15,000 years ago, migrating from Siberia across a land bridge that once connected Asia and North America. But who these earliest settlers truly were, and how they adapted to the unforgiving cold, remains a question shrouded in the mists of time. Tools, spearheads, and fragments of campsites offer fragments of an answer, but never the full story. One of the earliest mysteries belongs to the Dorset people, an Arctic culture that thrived long before the Inuit expanded across the north. The Dorset were skilled hunters, creators of haunting masks and artisans of small carved figures that seemed to carry expressions frozen in stone. And then, Around the year 1500, they vanished. Some suggest that the Inuit displaced them. Others believe climate change, famine, or disease ended their world. Yet Inuit oral traditions still tell of encounters with another people, the Tuniat, described as powerful but timid, living apart from others. Were the Tuniat the last remnants of the Dorset? No written record exists to tell us. Their disappearance remains an unsolved riddle in Canada's deep past. If the Arctic holds mysteries of disappearance, the eastern coast holds mysteries of arrival. Around the year 1000, Norse explorers, sailing from Greenland, reached the shores of Newfoundland. At L'Anse aux Meadows, archaeologists unearthed evidence of Viking settlements, sod houses, iron nails, and workshops. These discoveries confirmed that Vikings had crossed the Atlantic nearly 500 years before Columbus. Yet here too, the story is incomplete. Why did they abandon their outpost so quickly? Did they clash with indigenous peoples? Were they defeated by the harsh climate? Or did they attempt further voyages that ended in disaster? Norse sagas tell of encounters with the Skraeling jar, likely indigenous peoples, and describe both trade and violence. Some scholars suggest there were additional Viking settlements deeper inland, perhaps along the coast of Labrador, or even Nova Scotia. If so, time has hidden them well. The forest and soil have erased their traces, leaving only a handful of ruins in Newfoundland as a whisper of what might have been. The possibility of undiscovered Viking sites still tantalizes historians. When Europeans arrived again in the 1500s, led by explorers such as Jacques Cartier, they carried with them their own legends. Cartier heard from indigenous guides about a great northern kingdom called Saguenay, a land rich with gold, silver, and copper. But no such place has ever been found. Was Saguenay a real civilization lost to time, a misunderstanding born of translation, or a fabrication to mislead the French? The story haunted explorers for decades, sending men deeper into the wilderness in search of a city that never appeared. Even established settlements sometimes dissolved into mystery. Small French outposts along the St. Lawrence River were abandoned without explanation. Their colonists vanished into the forests. A few were discovered later, taken in by indigenous nations, but many simply disappeared. Did they die of disease, starve during harsh winters, or assimilate fully into new communities? The records are silent. What remains is the haunting sense of people swallowed by the wilderness. The 16th and 17th centuries also brought another layer of mystery: the maps themselves. Early European charts of North America sometimes displayed coastlines that did not exist, phantom islands like Friesland or Antilia. Some maps marked strange bays and inlets in Canadian waters that no one has ever rediscovered. Were these mistakes, deliberate deceptions, or hints of expeditions that were lost and erased from history? Each map, faded and yellowed, leaves us wondering what secrets its makers thought they had seen. Perhaps the most famous of all Canadian enigmas is the so-called Money Pit of Oak Island, Nova Scotia. In 1795, 3 boys digging into a curious depression found layers of wooden platforms buried in the ground. Over the following 2 centuries, treasure hunters from across the world tried to excavate it, convinced that untold riches lay below. Theories abounded: pirate treasure from Captain Kidd, lost manuscripts of Shakespeare, even sacred relics like the Holy Grail. Yet every dig was plagued by collapse, flooding, and death. Coconut fibers, foreign to the region, were discovered deep underground, suggesting deliberate engineering. Inscribed stones were said to bear cryptic symbols. And yet, despite millions of dollars and lifetimes of effort, the mystery of Oak Island remains unsolved. If there was ever treasure, it is still hidden, or perhaps never existed at all. But Canada's mysteries are not only buried in the ground. Some sail the seas. Sailors have long told of the fiery phantom ship that haunts the Northumberland Strait. Witnesses claim to see a full-rigged vessel, its sails engulfed in flame, only for it to vanish without a trace. Though dismissed as illusion or atmospheric trickery, the legend has endured for centuries. More chilling still is the true story of the Franklin expedition. In 1845, Sir John Franklin set out with 2 ships, the HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, to chart the Northwest Passage. Both disappeared into the Arctic ice. Search parties found scattered remains, journals, and evidence of cannibalism among the starving crew. It was not until the 21st century that the wrecks of Erebus and Terror were discovered, preserved beneath icy waters. Yet even with their discovery, questions remain. Why did the crew abandon their ships when they were still seaworthy? Was it madness induced by lead poisoning, desperation from starvation, or something stranger? Beyond ships and treasure, Canada's Indigenous nations preserve mysteries in story and sacred site. The Mi'kmaq tell of Glooskap, the giant who shaped rivers and valleys. The Cree recall thunderbirds who controlled the skies. The Haida carved beings into totem poles whose meanings still stir debate. Near Peterborough, Ontario, more than 900 petroglyphs cover a great expanse of stone, depicting humans, animals, and abstract shapes. Some believe they record spiritual visions. Others suggest they may represent astronomical knowledge. Their true meaning remains known only to the ancestors who carved them. All these mysteries, vanished peoples, lost settlements, phantom maps, cursed islands, ghost ships, sacred carvings, combine to form the shadow side of Canada's history. They are the gaps, the unanswered questions, the unsolved puzzles. Together they remind us that history is not a straight line of facts, but a tapestry of uncertainty and imagination. Canada's story begins not with certainty, but with mystery. And those mysteries set the stage for everything that follows. If mystery is the fog that surrounds Canada's history, then suspicion is the fire that burns beneath it. Where mysteries leave us with silence, suspicion fills the gaps with human fear, rivalry, and doubt. For centuries, this northern land has not only been shaped by explorers and settlers but also by paranoia. About enemies unseen, loyalties untested, and dangers both real and imagined. Suspicion first grew in the earliest encounters between Europeans and Indigenous nations. Trade brought opportunity, but also unease. The French, who settled along the St. Lawrence River, built fragile alliances with the Huron and Algonquin. Yet every handshake carried suspicion. Would this alliance hold? Or would it crumble under pressure from the Iroquois Confederacy, who had their own powerful networks of trade and war? The French suspected betrayal at every turn, while Indigenous nations wondered if these strange newcomers sought only trade or the slow theft of their lands. Trust was rare, and suspicion ran deep. As settlements grew, suspicion spread within the colonies themselves. Harsh winters and scarce resources bred whispers of disloyalty. When crops failed or disease struck, neighbors accused each other of hoarding or sabotage. Small communities, cut off from larger towns, sometimes erupted into bitter disputes. Suspicion was not only political but personal, a force that could divide a village as surely as it divided empires. The British, after taking control from the French in 1763, faced suspicion from nearly every direction. French Canadians suspected that British rule would erase their language and religion. Indigenous nations suspected broken promises, as treaties were signed with one hand and ignored with the other. Even within the British colonies, suspicion simmered between loyalists who had fled the American Revolution and settlers who had no interest in loyalty to a distant king. Could these divided peoples truly form a single colony, let alone a single country? Many doubted it. Suspicion also shaped Canada's relationship with the United States. The War of 1812 revealed just how fragile the borderlands were. Canadian militias, British soldiers, and Indigenous warriors fought together against American invasions. But afterward, suspicion lingered on both sides of the line. To the Americans, Canada was a stubborn outpost of British power, a potential conquest that slipped through their grasp. To Canadians, the United States was a looming threat, powerful, restless, and never entirely trustworthy. The border, stretching thousands of kilometers, became not just a line on a map but a line of suspicion, where watchtowers and forts rose against possible invasion. In the 19th century, suspicion took new forms. Immigrants arrived from Ireland, Scotland, China, and beyond, bringing new cultures and labor that fueled the growth of towns and railroads. But instead of welcome, many were met with suspicion. Irish Catholics were suspected of undermining Protestant rule. Chinese workers, after building the railways with their sweat and blood, were branded as outsiders and burdened with a head tax meant to keep them apart. Suspicion of the foreigner became a permanent shadow in Canadian society. Even in the north, where explorers sought the Northwest Passage, suspicion crept in. The Franklin expedition's disappearance did not only spark mystery, it also fueled suspicion. Some accused rival nations of hiding the truth. Others whispered that the Admiralty itself concealed evidence of failure to protect its reputation. The Arctic ice preserved the bodies of Franklin's men, but suspicion preserved the scandal of their fate in the minds of those who studied it. Suspicion often targeted those who resisted authority. In the Red River region, when the Métis under Louis Riel rose to defend their land and culture, the government in Ottawa treated them not as citizens with grievances, but as rebels to be feared. Riel himself was haunted by suspicion on every side. English settlers suspected him of treachery, Indigenous allies suspected him of compromise, and the Canadian state suspected him of sedition. His eventual execution in 1885 was not only a political act, but a symbol of how suspicion can strangle trust between peoples. Religious suspicion, too, shaped Canada's development. Catholic and Protestant communities eyed each other warily, especially in Quebec and Ontario, where schools, politics, and even neighborhoods were divided along faith lines. Each side suspected the other of undermining the nation's future. These tensions flared into open hostility at times, leaving scars that would last for generations. By the dawn of the 20th century, suspicion had seeped into the very foundations of government. Spies were suspected in the shadows, especially during the First World War, when fear of German sabotage led to the internment of immigrants from enemy nations. Ukrainian, German, and even Eastern European settlers who had tilled the soil of Canada for years suddenly found themselves branded as possible traitors. Suspicion transformed neighbors into enemies overnight, fueled by war and paranoia. And yet suspicion was not always destructive. At times it forced vigilance, demanding that Canada defend itself against threats both external and internal. Suspicion of American expansion hardened Canadian identity, reminding settlers that they were not simply an extension of their southern neighbors. Suspicion of British neglect pushed colonies to band together, eventually laying the groundwork for Confederation. Even suspicion among communities sometimes gave rise to debates, reforms, and the slow march toward recognition of rights. But suspicion is a double-edged sword. It can protect, but it can also poison. In Canada's history, suspicion often left communities divided, cultures wounded, and trust shattered. It is a theme that runs like a dark current beneath the story of a land too vast to ever be fully understood. Canada's history cannot be told only through battles and treaties. It must also be told through suspicion, the quiet force that shaped choices, stirred conflicts, and left shadows on the land. Where mystery invites wonder, suspicion breeds unease. And together they set the stage for moments of great reckoning, the climaxes of history that decide the fate of nations. History builds tension slowly, but every story reaches a point where events collide, choices are tested, and the outcome can no longer be avoided. In Canada, the climax of its early history is not one single battle or treaty. It is a series of pivotal moments where survival, identity, and sovereignty were all at stake. These moments would define not just the land, but the people who called it home. The struggle between European powers created the first great turning point. French and British settlers, along with their Indigenous allies, clashed repeatedly across rivers, forests, and plains. The 7 Years' War, known in North America as the French and Indian War, was more than a distant European conflict. It was a battle for the very soul of the continent. In 1759, at the Plains of Abraham near Quebec City, the French forces faced the British in a confrontation that would alter Canada forever. General Wolfe led his troops up the cliffs in a daring maneuver, a decision that carried immense risk. Marquis de Montcalm commanded the French, determined to defend New France. The clash was brutal, decisive, and tragic. Both commanders would die that day. The British emerged victorious, and New France passed into their control, but the cultural and social repercussions would echo for centuries. Even as the British assumed control, the seeds of tension remained. French Canadians, determined to preserve their language, religion, and traditions, lived under a government that often viewed them with suspicion. Indigenous nations, too, faced profound challenges. Promises made during wartime alliances were often broken, their lands encroached upon, and their societies forever altered. The climax of conquest was not only military, it was cultural, societal, and psychological. The struggle for identity and survival had reached its peak. Suspicion and resistance continued in the early 19th century. The War of 1812 brought Canada to the brink once more. American forces, believing the young colonies were ripe for annexation, launched invasions along the Great Lakes and the Niagara frontier. Canadian militias, Indigenous warriors, and British regulars fought in coordination, defying a more populous adversary. Battles like Queenston Heights and Lundy's Lane were chaotic, violent, and emblematic of a land caught between empires. Laura Secord, a remarkable woman, risked her life to warn British forces of an impending attack, a single act that shifted the course of a battle. In these moments, the survival of the territory hung by a thread, resting on courage, strategy, and chance. As the century progressed, internal pressures came to the forefront. The Red River region, home to the Métis under Louis Riel, became a flashpoint. The Métis, people of mixed Indigenous and European ancestry, faced encroachment on their lands as settlers and government agents sought to impose new rules. In 1869, Riel led a provisional government, asserting Métis rights and demanding recognition. The climax of this conflict was not a distant battlefield, but a confrontation over sovereignty, legality, and the right to exist as a distinct people. The government in Ottawa, threatened by Riel's assertion, responded with force. The events escalated until Riel's capture and eventual execution in 1885, a decision that would haunt Canadian politics for generations and mark one of the most intense points of cultural confrontation in the nation's history. Meanwhile, the push toward Confederation represented another climax in Canada's story. By 1867, the colonies of Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia united under the British North America Act, forming the Dominion of Canada. But unity was fragile. Provinces debated representation, cultural rights, and the protection of minority populations. Indigenous nations were often excluded from these negotiations, their land claims ignored or misunderstood. Railways and economic development promised to bind east to west, yet the challenges of geography and climate tested these ambitions. The creation of a unified nation was a climax not merely of politics, but of vision, struggle, and negotiation, a moment where the future of a vast, diverse land hung in the balance. Expansion into the west added further intensity. The construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway in the 1880s was an engineering marvel, but it was also a battlefield of labor, law, and culture. Chinese workers faced discrimination, perilous working conditions, and a society that treated them as outsiders while relying on their labor. Indigenous communities were pushed into reserves, and the residential school system began, removing children from their families and attempting to erase language and culture. These actions marked a dark climax in Canada's growth. Rapid development and national consolidation came at immense human cost. Resistance, resilience, and sorrow intersected in ways that would define the ethical and moral contours of the nation for generations. The world wars of the 20th century brought Canada to new climaxes on the international stage. In World War I, the country's troops fought with courage at Vimy Ridge, Passchendaele, and other brutal battles. Sacrifice was immense, yet Canada's identity was strengthened, moving closer to autonomy from Britain. World War II amplified this process. Canadian soldiers, sailors, and airmen participated in D-Day, the Battle of the Atlantic, and campaigns across Europe. The stakes were global and the challenges immense, but these events cemented Canada's role as a nation capable of decisive action on the world stage. Economic, social, and political crises further intensified Canada's historical climax. The Great Depression of the 1930s tested resilience. Farmers, workers, and families faced starvation, unemployment, and despair. Governments experimented with new programs to address inequality and stabilize society, culminating in the foundations of Canada's modern welfare state. Each challenge forced the nation to confront its priorities, morality, and capacity for collective action. Even culturally, Canada's climax is evident. The struggle to balance dual linguistic and cultural identities, French and English, Indigenous and immigrant, shaped policy, law, and education. Quebec nationalism, debates over bilingualism, and the struggle for Indigenous rights all reached moments of intense tension and negotiation. These cultural peaks were as crucial as military victories, revealing that the true climax of Canadian history is not a single instant, but a series of convergences where identity, survival, and justice are tested simultaneously. By the mid-20th century, Canada's climactic moments had established a pattern. Each generation faced its own set of trials, from foreign threats to internal disputes, from social upheaval to the fight for cultural preservation. The country's vastness, diversity, and history of conflict had forged a nation capable of navigating complexity, yet never without cost. The cumulative effect of conquest, war, resistance, expansion, and reconciliation represents a sustained climax, a point where every challenge and triumph collided to create the Canada we recognize today. Canada's climax is not neatly tied to a single date or treaty. It is instead a series of intense trials, moments where courage, strategy, and human will determined outcomes of lasting significance. Battles were fought not only with weapons, but with ideas, culture, and determination. The land itself, with its rivers, forests, and mountains, became both a participant and witness to these events. Every conflict, every negotiation, and every act of defiance contributed to the crescendo of Canadian history, shaping its character, resilience, and identity. The story of Canada's climax reminds us that nationhood is not born in peace, nor is it simply granted. It emerges through struggle, decision, and confrontation with both external threats and internal contradictions. In every mountain scaled, every city defended, every law debated, and every life sacrificed, Canada's history reached peaks of tension that forced choices with enduring consequences. It is this accumulation of trials, the intersecting moments of bravery, fear, injustice, and hope, that defines the nation's climactic chapter. The history of Canada is not only a record of events, it is a story of society, of communities shaped and reshaped by every wave of settlement, conflict, and cultural encounter. The impacts of conquest, migration, industry, and policy reach far beyond battlefields and treaties. They echo in the lives of everyday people, in the structures of towns, in laws, and in the unspoken agreements that hold communities together. European colonization left profound and lasting marks on Indigenous societies. Trade initially brought mutual benefit, furs for tools, beads for alliances. Yet alongside commerce came disease, displacement, and cultural disruption. Entire communities were decimated by smallpox, influenza, and measles, while colonial policies systematically undermined traditional governance and spiritual practices. The residential school system, beginning in the 19th century, attempted to erase Indigenous identity, forcibly removing children from their families and communities. Generations endured trauma whose repercussions are still felt today, shaping contemporary discussions on reconciliation and social justice. The arrival of diverse immigrant populations further shaped Canada's social fabric. The British and French were joined by Irish, Scottish, German, Chinese, Ukrainian, and many other groups, each contributing labor, culture, and new perspectives. Communities formed around shared language, religion, and heritage, sometimes fostering inclusion and innovation, other times creating tension and exclusion. The Chinese head tax and restrictive immigration policies reflected societal fears, prejudice, and suspicion of newcomers, yet the contributions of these communities remain vital to Canada's economic and cultural development. Urbanization and industrialization transformed society as well. Cities such as Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver grew rapidly, bringing opportunities and challenges. Industrial labor created wealth but also harsh conditions. Strikes, protests, and labor movements became essential instruments for social change. Workers demanded fair wages, safety, and dignity. Women, too, began asserting their presence in public life, demanding suffrage, education, and professional opportunities. These societal shifts challenged traditional hierarchies and laid the foundation for modern Canada's emphasis on equity and inclusion. Canada's participation in the World Wars also profoundly affected its society. The mobilization of troops required the cooperation of entire communities, fostering national identity and pride. Yet the wars also highlighted inequalities. Indigenous soldiers, Black Canadians, and other minorities often faced discrimination while serving abroad or upon returning home. The post-war period saw the emergence of social programs, veterans' benefits, and the expansion of public education, reshaping Canadian society and embedding the idea that collective responsibility is essential for national cohesion. Cultural and linguistic duality further shaped social dynamics. The coexistence of English and French communities created unique challenges and opportunities. Conflicts over language, religion, and governance often led to tension, but also fostered negotiation, compromise, and the development of policies that attempted to preserve both identities. Quebec in particular became a focal point for debates over autonomy, language rights, and cultural preservation. These societal dynamics encouraged Canadians to think deeply about the meaning of unity within diversity, a principle that continues to influence national identity. Canada's natural environment also influenced society. The harsh winters, vast forests, and wide plains demanded resilience, cooperation, and ingenuity. Indigenous knowledge of the land, waterways, and climate informed European settlers' survival strategies. Later, industrial development and urban planning had to contend with the same environmental challenges, shaping settlement patterns, architecture, and economic activity. Society's relationship with the land has always been a defining factor in Canadian history, reinforcing the bond between people and place. Education, law, and governance became critical tools in shaping society. Policies surrounding schooling, property, suffrage, and civil rights reflected broader social priorities and tensions. Efforts to create national curricula, recognize minority rights, and establish legal protections illustrate how societal values were debated and codified over generations. These efforts, often contentious, reveal the ongoing struggle to balance unity and diversity, tradition and progress. Canada's social development is also a story of resilience. Communities rebuilt after natural disasters, economic downturns, and epidemics. Social movements, ranging from labor unions to Indigenous rights campaigns to feminist activism, challenged the status quo and demanded inclusion. Each movement reshaped laws, norms, and public consciousness. The societal impact of these struggles cannot be measured merely in legislation. It is visible in everyday life, in the persistence of traditions, in evolving social attitudes, and in the continuing effort to reconcile the past with the present. Today, Canada's societal landscape reflects these layers of history. The multicultural mosaic, the bilingual framework, and the ongoing reconciliation with Indigenous nations are all products of centuries of interaction, conflict, and cooperation. Social cohesion in Canada is not passive. It is actively constructed through dialogue, compromise, and a recognition of shared responsibilities. The legacies of mistrust, conquest, and resilience remain, reminding citizens that society is not inherited. It is continuously shaped by choices, values, and collective action. In understanding societal impact, one sees that history is more than events. It is people. It is families and communities, traditions maintained and lost, conflicts endured and overcome. Canada's story is a testament to human adaptability and the ongoing work of building a just, inclusive society. Social structures, cultural identities, and communal responsibilities all emerged from centuries of negotiation and struggle, forming the backbone of modern Canada. The lessons of the past, both dark and triumphant, continue to influence society, reminding us that history's impact is never fully behind us, but lives on in our communities, policies, and shared identity. Canada's history is a tapestry woven with mystery, suspicion, and climactic struggle. From the vanished peoples of the Arctic to the battles that decided empires, from the courage of ordinary citizens to the resilience of entire communities, Every chapter has shaped the nation's identity. History is not simply a record of dates and events. It is the story of human will, of societies tested, and of lessons learned from triumphs and failures alike. As we reflect on Chapter 1, we see that Canada's past is both inspiring and sobering. It reminds us of the endurance required to survive harsh landscapes, the courage to resist injustice, and the necessity of compromise in a land defined by diversity. The legacies of Indigenous nations, European settlers, and countless immigrants converge to form a nation that continues to evolve, always balancing heritage, innovation, and responsibility. If you want to uncover the next layers of Canada's story, the conflicts, innovations, and hidden tales that have shaped the modern nation, stay with us as we journey deeper into its history. Each chapter reveals not only what Canada was, but what it can become. The story is far from over, and the adventure is just beginning.